Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. Lots of love to all of you. You're all so very special to me, and I want you to know that. And I really appreciate your comments and your lovely kind words, because it makes what I do so worthwhile, and I really love sharing these fabulous stories with you, and I hope you're enjoying them as much as I do, because I always say, and I repeat this over and over again until I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, but I always say, nothing in this world beats a good story. It gives you a skip in the step, it makes each day lighter and richer. And without stories, our life would be so much less. And I think the old people from the olden days, when they used to sit beside the fire and listen to the stories that the grandfathers would tell them, they knew this. They knew life would be so much less rich without listening to a good story. And let's get started with tonight's story, shall we? Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my extraordinary Bigfoot story begins in the 1980s. At the time, I was 18 years old, and in my final year at school, with aspirations of becoming a vet, and with my high grades, it seemed a given that I would achieve my goal. But growing up, I had a passion for animals, and over the course of my childhood, I had rescued many indigenous species, bringing them back to full health, and releasing them very successfully back into the wild. It was at that young age that I decided unequivocally that I wanted to become a vet one day. My friends fancied becoming firemen, rally drivers, policemen or truckers. Then they would change their minds, seasonally, like the changing weather. A circus trainer, a pilot perhaps. But my desire to be a vet remained unwavering, even when I was a young impressionable boy with a malleable mind that was given to contrariness. One little black raven I rescued as a boy would continue to visit me every year for 10 years in a row, until she never returned. There was no doubt in my mind she knew I had saved her life, and continued to come back and see me, as her gratitude towards me was immense. She even introduced me to her partner. I knew that all animals have emotional intelligence, for I discovered this in all the wildlife I saved as a young child, and they were incredibly grateful to me for sparing their lives, often leaving their cages hesitantly when they finally were returned to the wild. This raven that I saved would visit me every summer, and she would perch on my shoulder like a tame parrot, and happily eat the crumbs from my hands. I called her Fledge, as I had found her as a fledgling, having fallen out of her mother's nest. And when I discovered her in a sorry state, I did not hold up much hope for her, but her determination to live overcame all the odds stacked against her. For ravens have what I would describe as a tenacious spirit. I want to assure you that that bird knew I had saved her life, and never failed to thank me for my little act of kindness, returning every year like clockwork to say, "Hello there, I love you. I want to thank you for what you did for me. I haven't forgotten." I also rescued cats, foxes, dogs, a baby deer, a raccoon, and many more injured animals, too many to count. The vet I initially took them to insisted I put them down at once. I think the words he would use were, "There is no hope for this animal." He would look into my concerned young face and say, "I'm sorry, young man. The kindest thing for you to do is to put him out of his misery." I would shake my head and say, "Sorry, sir, but I just can't do that." I'll never forget the look he gave me. It was a kind of, "You're very young. You have no idea what you're talking about look. You should listen to me. I know best." I genuinely didn't think he had the animals' best interests at heart. He was so quick to give up on them, and I'm glad I didn't listen to him, as my instincts told me he was absolutely wrong. He told me that the animals would likely die of pain, but instead they fully recovered. I never went back to that vet again. I refused to give up on animals, and they became robustly healthy, returning to the wild, most of them. I remember when our boxer dog Lacey was giving birth to 8 puppies, she struggled with one of the puppies that just got so entangled up inside her and stuck. But I helped her by pulling the baby out of her, which facilitated the smooth birth of all the other puppies that were soon to follow. I was later told I'd saved her life and the life of her puppies. Growing up in my young life, there were moments that I remember with such pinpoint accuracy, as if every detail has been inscribed in a book or an ancient scroll that can never ever be forgotten. The first time I met my grandmother's brother was one of the most memorable times. He was such a special man, who had the kind of energy that when he walked into a room, people would just naturally look at him. They might wonder why they were looking at him, but something about him would get their attention, as it always did mine. I think I would describe him as having a light that you could not physically see, but almost certainly feel. His name was Walter. To look at, he may have appeared a little eccentric. He dressed like a real refined gentleman, wearing the rather formal attire of yesteryear that had not changed with the times, the old-fashioned waistcoats, tweed jackets, smart white linen shirts, cravats, and very elegant shoes that were polished to perfection, as I believe he'd been in the military, and those men learned to keep their shoes looking as good as new. I met Walter when I was 12 years old, and he was one of the nicest people I have ever known, with kind cornflower blue eyes, and a skin that was as wrinkled as a wizened tortoise, as it only added to his charm. He looked like a man who had really lived life and experienced the rocky ups and downs in life, coming through the dark tunnel of life's challenges, a little battle-weary but victorious nonetheless. I did not ask him about his stunt in the military, as I sensed he'd seen some things that you cannot unsee, things that make you witness the darker side of human nature, where you come face to face with the raw, brutal side of our mortality. For Walter had seen people on the battlefield with a leg blown off, and far more grisly sights than that frankly I didn't want to entertain. He was married to a lovely lady called Violet, who dyed her curly white hair pale purple, which was very trendy at the time for the older generation in the 1980s. In Violet's case, her hair colour matched her eyes, which I could swear had a purple hue, much like Elizabeth Taylor. When I looked at pictures of her as a young woman, she rather reminded me of the famous actress. I marvelled at her perfect skin, which was like a peach, flawless and smooth, without a wrinkle in sight, and her secret to maintaining a perfect skin was never to sit out in the sun without being under the shade of a large floppy sun hat. I had never been a romantic, well, not really, as I always believed stories were birthed out of fictitious romantic novels, written by romantic novelists like Barbara Cartland, where the prince gallantly rescues the helpless young lady from her desperate plight, like some kind of superhero. But my grandmother's brother had a genuine love story behind his belt, about how he met his beloved wife Violet, which he told me many times growing up, as his life completely revolved around his wife. I remember the day when I met Violet. It was pouring with rain, he told me. It was bucketing down. But that was common in London, much like in Washington, where you can experience several seasons in a single day. I found myself sitting on a red London bus in Oxford Circus, far away from my home in America, where I'd grown up in Washington. I was intending to walk, but the rain pelted down, so I decided to catch a bus, not knowing where the hell I was going, but it really didn't matter. I was staying in London for 3 weeks, and so I decided to let the day dictate its course for me, to see where it would ultimately take me. At the time, I was 28 years old, and wanted to settle down and get married, but Mrs. Wright had not crossed my path, and I was not simply prepared to settle. I'd enjoyed relationships with other women in the past. My parents were pressing me to marry one of them. "But she's such a nice lass," my mother would say. "You could do so much worse, Walter." I didn't think nice constituted to getting married. I knew I was looking for something more in a woman, and if I didn't find it, I was not prepared to commit. I didn't want to just settle, end up in a relationship that would spontaneously combust due to conflicting issues between us. I'd seen enough war in my life, and I didn't want a wife who became my enemy. That is no way for a man to live. I was looking for an ally, someone who'd always have my back, and vice versa. And a sense of humour for me was the number one thing I looked for in a woman, as it was humour in the military that got us through the most testing and trying times of our lives. In my opinion, you were better off living alone until you met someone who synchronized with me like a perfectly tuned instrument. It didn't help that by nature I was quite reticent. I didn't have a raincoat with me on that day, so when it began to bucket down without apology, I had two choices: dash into the closest department store to seek cover, or jump onto the nearest London red bus. The latter seemed like a jolly good idea to me. I was a tourist in London, so I could observe this great post-war city under the showers of rain without getting wet. I think many people had similar clever ideas to escape the rain in this ingenious way. The bus suddenly became heavily packed, and a few people were forced to stand. That was when I saw her. A young woman got onto the bus. There was something about her that took my breath away. Even all these years later, I don't know exactly what it was. She was pretty enough, of course, but it wasn't that. She was out of breath as she got on the bus, which suggested that she'd had a run to catch it. I'll never forget when she walked down the bus and stopped where I was sitting, looking down at the empty seat next to mine. She gave me an inquiring look, followed by a genuine warm smile, and said, "Do you mind if I sit here, or are you keeping the seat for someone else?" My heart began to thump in my chest because this beautiful woman was sitting next to me. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. I wanted to say something to this woman, but an awkward lump developed in the back of my throat, so I just nodded. I was inwardly cursing myself. "Walter, you idiot! Couldn't you have said something? Maybe you could be talking to this woman now, you useless lump of clay." The young woman was wearing an elegant emerald green coat with velvet black buttons down the middle, and her eyes were the colour of purple lobelia. She was wearing a matching, very fetching French-style green beret across her shoulder-length dark curly hair, and as she sat down next to me, she opened up a leather bag and pulled out a book that I'd read 2 years prior. I knew fate was giving me an earnest, sharp nudge, a helping hand to help me start a conversation with this beguiling young woman, as if whispering in my spirit, "Go on, talk to her, Walter." I wanted to say, "I've read that book, you know," but I was unable to say a word. But my heart was fluttering a dime to a dozen. I think if the woman had not been so pretty, I might have actually found my voice. But I was completely tongue-tied. The heavens had opened. It was pelting down heavily, and the thunder boomed, rolled and grumbled in the distance like a cantankerous old man. Even though it was about 11 in the morning, the sun had slipped away like the dinner guest at a party who wants to make a quick retreat, and the sky was covered in pewter-coloured clouds. While I was on the bus, the rain trailed down the windows like long tears. It looked ominously as if the sad clouds were clogged up with more tears that needed still to be shed. The great ribbons of asphalt were gleaming from water, as if they'd been newly polished, and everything looked fresh and clean under the showers. People were dashing hurriedly for cover in the shops, some holding their purses above their heads, while others ran down the sidewalk under black umbrellas. Wherever I looked, I saw so many black umbrellas, hundreds and hundreds of them, it would seem. The rain began to subside. I was heartily relieved. I did not fancy returning to my hotel in Chelsea looking like a drowned rat. I hasten to say, when the young woman got off the bus, I followed her discreetly. Looking back, it certainly didn't occur to me that this could be construed as very inappropriate stalking behaviour, but I wanted to see where this mysterious woman was going. I was desperate to ask her out on a date, but I was far too bashful to have the courage to do so. I watched her going into the bakery, where there were tables set out like a coffee shop. A waitress was taking her order, and I did the same, choosing a table further away from her. I don't remember what I ordered, but I do remember when this beautiful young lady got up to leave the bakery that I began to panic. The inside of my chest was flapping away like a frantic pigeon. If I didn't ask this mysterious woman on a date, I would likely never see her again. London is a very big place. But what if she rejected me, or thought I was some kind of creepy weirdo hitting on her inappropriately? My mind wrestled with all these thoughts. The woman paid her bill and fortuitously left the half-open book that she was reading behind. This was my quintessential opportunity to strike while the iron was hot. Fate was giving me another encouraging nudge to ask this lovely lady out. It must be serendipitous, written in the stars, I thought. I hurriedly grabbed her book, and I tried to run after her, but she had all but disappeared into the crowd, had vanished from my sight, was nowhere to be seen. I had lost her, and for a moment a light inside me went out. Why had I been such a coward? So what if she had rejected me? Was it such a big deal? Was I not man enough to accept that? I could live with that. But what I could not live with is letting a good thing like her, or an opportunity like this, slip between my fingers like butter. Growing up, my father had said taking risks was the only way to accomplish anything in life, and I had held by that principle until now. The next day I went back to the bakery, in the hope that the young woman would return to ask for her book. I had ordered a coffee, but after waiting a couple of hours, I gave up and was about to hand in the book to the coffee shop when I looked up to see the woman of the previous day with the green beret and coat asking the lady if her book had been handed in. "Excuse me, I'm so sorry to bother you. Yesterday I was in your bakery. I ordered a coffee, and I remembered I had an appointment that I couldn't miss. I rushed off in a frantic, tearing hurry, and accidentally left the book I was reading behind. Has anyone by any chance handed it in? It's quite important, you see, because I borrowed it from a friend of mine. I need to give it back to her." The lady behind the counter shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but no book was handed in, I'm afraid." "Are you sure?" asked the young lady. "I don't mean to bother you, but could you just check for a moment? It's so important." That was when I walked over to the young woman, and I lifted up the book in my hands. "Were you looking for this by any chance?" The young lady's eyes lit up like two purple amethysts. "Oh, thank you so much! You've no idea how disappointed I would be to lose this book. It belongs to a friend of mine, you see. But not only that, I've got to such an exciting part in the story." I raised a brow at her and said, "Let me guess. The Countess is about to find out that Lord Lindley was not her real father, and that her mother had an affair with the butler at Burberfield Manor. Is that where you're at?" The young woman looked at me in surprise. "You know the story?" I raised my hand. "I do. I've read the book. It's a very good book, I hasten to say." "Wait a minute," she said, looking at me curiously. "You look very familiar. Where have I seen you before? I never forget a face, but you have an American accent, so I can't place you. I don't know any Americans apart from my uncle's wife, Cordelia." I told her that she'd been sitting next to me on the bus the day before. She insisted on buying me a coffee to thank me for finding the book. And she was very intrigued by my American accent, said she liked it very much. I told her I'd read the story, and we discussed aspects of the book together, and we just clicked. The long and the short of it is I invited her to Washington. She stayed with me for 3 weeks there, but never left. We decided to go off and get married, and that was that. I knew she was the one. She was so much more than a nice girl. It was a bonus that she was pretty, but none of the above mattered. We were connected on a soul level, kindred spirits, you could say. When marriages fail, it's because the couple did not connect on this deep level. When Walter told me his story, I wondered whether I'd get as lucky as he did, because I could see even late in life this couple was still madly in love with each other. And that does not always happen. It would seem even all those years ago, with oceans between people, when something is preordained, it's clearly meant to be. Which was certainly the case for Walter and Violet. I knew they lived in Washington State, in a green, leafy neighborhood with a woodland area behind their home of public property, which was a natural habitat for thriving indigenous wildlife. I would regularly visit Walter and Violet for lunch on many occasions, and they were such an old-fashioned couple. Violet, being English, would present me with these 3-course meals, and she'd always prepare traditional English roasts, like beef and Yorkshire pudding, or chicken with sage and onion stuffing, bacon rolls, chipolata sausages, bread sauce and gravy, followed by traditional English classics like trifle, spotted dick with custard, or sticky toffee pudding. Violet had a passion for Pekingese dogs, and when I was 18 years old she asked me if I wouldn't mind house-sitting for her during the summer holidays, as she and Walter were going to England to stay with relatives in Cornwall and Norfolk, and were intending to spend a week on the Norfolk Broads with Violet's sister on a houseboat. Violet wanted me to take care of her 2 Pekingese dogs while she was away. One was called Billingsgate, the other Shakespeare. I told them it would be an absolute pleasure. I was 18 years old and enjoying my own place for the summer holidays, and being paid for the privilege was nothing to be sneezed at, and Violet intended to pay me well, as the couple considered both Shakespeare and Billingsgate to be the beloved children that they'd never had. I hasten to say I never asked them why they had no children. It just didn't seem right to intrude on their privacy. Otherwise, I believe they would have volunteered the information to me freely. My grandmother had once asked Walter many moons ago why he and Violet had never had any children, and he shut her down at once and said he'd rather not talk about the matter, and my grandmother privately concluded that the lovely couple had experienced fertility issues. When I arrived at Walter and Violet's house, I parked my father's second-hand Buick he'd given me permission to use outside their front door. The door swung open, and there she was with open arms greeting me with a warm hug, while her 2 white Pekingeses followed her closely behind, eyeing me with a degree of suspicion. I knew I'd have to win them around, for these 2 dogs were clearly not friendly to strangers. Over lunch that day, Violet informed me they were leaving in the morning for England, but she needed to go over a few details first with me concerning the dogs. She seemed unduly tense about something. I privately wondered if she was having last-minute reservations about me looking after her beloved Pekingese. She was naturally very attached to the dogs, and was probably secretly troubled about offloading them onto me. Did she not realise I was a devoted animal lover that would soon be qualifying as a vet? Violet was looking down at the food on her plate blankly, pushing it around with her knife and fork, as if she'd all but lost her appetite. 2 furrow lines developed between her eyebrows, and her violet eyes almost became grey, which always happened when she was feeling a little flustered about something. "Is something worrying you, Violet?" I asked her. "Are you concerned about the welfare of Shakespeare and Billingsgate, leaving them in my charge, that is? I want to assure you I will look after them very well. I know they're a little wary of me right now, but I will win their affections over, I assure you of that. I am very good with animals, you know." Violet looked at me kindly. "It's not that, dear," she said gingerly. "I'm quite sure you will do a fabulous job in taking care of my Billingsgate and Shakespeare. They can be quite fussy, but I'll go through the protocol with you. Their likes and dislikes, so to speak, their essential needs, but it's all pretty straightforward. And I'm so grateful to you, Montgomery, for taking care of them. I really am. I know my dogs could not be in better hands. Your grandmother told me all about the animals you've rescued over the years, and that lovely little raven fledgling that you saved that still visits you to this very day. Not many can boast of such an extraordinary story. Not many people have such marvellous ways with animals like you clearly do. You will become the kind of vet, Montgomery, that everybody wants to take their animals to, because you're so passionate about animals and will stop at nothing to bring their animals back from the brink of death. Everyone wants a vet who will echo their sentiments when it comes to their animals, and not be so quick to waggle that needle of death, unless, of course, it can't be helped." "Very true," said Walter, dabbing his face with a white starched napkin. "I must reiterate the sentiments of my wife, Montgomery. Without you taking care of our beloved dogs, neither of us would be remotely confident of going abroad like this. They are like our children, Shakespeare and Billingsgate, but we know they are in great hands with you." He cleared his throat for a moment. "If you must know, Montgomery, Violet here is rather nervous about seeing her family after such a prolonged sabbatical. She and her sister Sabrina
had a tempestuous relationship at the very best of times. Sometimes, you know, two siblings of the same sex can get on famously well. Other times there is conflict. In Violet's case, her sister and her weathered some rough storms together. It hasn't been easy for Violet. It doesn't help, of course, that they're both as different as chalk and cheese, with not many interests in common. I see, I said. I wouldn't let that worry you, Violet. I'm sure things will resolve themselves with your sister, especially since you're older now. But I guess if you haven't seen your family for many years, it's going to be a rather nerve-wracking event. But I'm quite sure being in touch with them through phone calls and letters has eased the difficulty of being reunited with them again.
Of course it has. You're absolutely right there, Montgomery. Communication does make things so much easier. I've been writing to my family every week for many years. They were never thrilled when I moved to America. But I would have walked to the ends of the earth for Walter. He is my true love and my hero. She then turned to her husband and said, I'm so sorry, Walter, but we've got to tell Montgomery. I will not be able to rest until we do. I cannot just saunter off to the United Kingdom like this. With all this on my conscience, I just can't. We've got to tell him.
But are you sure you want to tell Montgomery? Said Walter obsequiously, reaching out to nudge his wife. I don't want poor Montgomery here to have any sleepless nights on our account. He is perfectly safe here. That's what matters. No harm will befall him, and a story like this might shake him to the core. Look, I said, I don't know what this is about, but I think you better tell me, now that you've gone this far. Whatever it is, I'm sure I can deal with it. I'm not that squeamish. Very well, said Walter. You tell Montgomery if you must, Violet.
I'm sure he'll hear about it soon enough, Walter, from some of the locals in the area, said Violet, and I think it's best if he hears it from us. Needless to say, everyone in this neighbourhood has been badly shaken up, Montgomery, by a fortuitous event. Everyone is locking doors and bolting windows. Everyone's feathers are terribly ruffled, I hasten to say.
What happened, Violet? I asked.
Violet stared at me through her purple eyes that grew wider and wider. She mumbled something inaudibly under her breath, which I thought sounded like the word "Vasheen." Sorry, I said.
What is Vasheen?
Walter cleared his throat.
Home invasion, he said. 2 doors down at Mr. and Mrs. Cartridge's house. A home invasion? For real? Are you being serious? I asked, not knowing what to make of what they were telling me.
Oh, please, Montgomery, don't you dare panic, said Violet gingerly, reaching out to squeeze my trembling hand. It's not going to happen here, I assure you of that. For a start, we have absolutely nothing to take that would be of the remotest interest to those robbers, who are after items of great value. Mr. and Mrs. Cartwright were an easy target, with poor security, for 2 people who have so many items that are worth a fortune in their possession. The police believe unequivocally it was an inside job. The 2 men that broke into Mrs. Cartridge's house were in their 20s. One of them spoke in a familiar voice that Mr. Cartridge recognized and remembered. But the trouble is, he doesn't know where he knows the voice from. It's driving him crazy ever since, racking his brains as to where the hell he heard that voice before. You see, the 2 men were masked, so he only saw their eyes. If he could remember, the police would have a great chance of arresting this man. The Cartridges are stinking rich, you know, but you wouldn't know it because they live very modestly. But the young men that broke into their property knew all about the family's treasured valuable heirlooms. 2 spectacular pieces of artwork by famous artists were taken, along with the family silver, some Chinese Ming vases, along with some precious family jewels, all gone. None of us on the street were even remotely aware that the Cartridges were so wealthy, until now. Now everyone knows, of course. It's too dreadful for words, said Violet, releasing a heavy sigh. Mrs. Cartwright is completely devastated, poor woman, about the break-in. She's shaken to the core by the threatening treatment she received from those ghastly thugs. But she's thankful to be alive. Some of the stuff taken is of a great deal of sentimental value to her. She'll never be able to get it back. These people make me so sick. Scaring two elderly people like that. Do they have no shame whatsoever? Clearly they don't have any conscience, said Violet, shuddering with disgust. Everyone in the neighbourhood is up in arms about the whole affair. And let's just say, all these sleeping dogs are now very much wide awake. People have stepped up their security exponentially. The police believe everyone in our neighbourhood is absolutely safe. The two people who were involved in this armed invasion knew all about the Cartridges' wealth. They believe, the police, that this is an inside job. The problem is the Cartridges have two cleaners and a couple of young men that attend to their yard. You don't know if these people are indirectly involved in the crime or not. It's all just idle speculation at the moment, but it is too terrible. But someone out there knows who was involved. What exactly happened, I asked. How did these people break into the Cartridges' house? Oh, that was easy enough. It wasn't too difficult, said Violet. They managed to squeeze through a downstairs window without being observed. The Cartridges were lying fast asleep in their bed when the thugs broke into their home. They were very discreet and very quiet. Their black Labrador was barking loudly, so the couple woke up to find two men in black balaclavas pointing rifles at them, asking them where their jewelry was. The Labrador was locked up in the toilet all night, poor thing. Mr. Cartridge led one of the robbers to the safe, but there was another safe under the floorboards, and these robbers knew about that one too. They couldn't have been privy to that knowledge without inside information, of course. The people in this neighbourhood had no clue, as I said, that the Cartridges were so wealthy. But these home invaders knew that they were, and demanded to know where the second safe was. Mrs. Cartridge was terribly shaken up, but who can blame her, given the treatment she received? That woman does not scare easily. She's got a heart of iron, she has. She described the two young men as the most aggressive men that she's ever seen. The devil's spawn, I believe she called them. She said they were so violent. They punched her in the eye. Her eye was completely black. And, of course, one of her ribs was broken. And that woman is no spring chicken, much like myself, I hasten to say. There really was no need for these two robust, strapping young men to be so vicious towards two defenceless elderly people. They tied them up and pistol-whipped Mr. Cartridge, kicking him in the chest. The man was covered in unsightly bruises, and his nose was bashed in by the thugs. He's now had to have reconstructive surgery to fix up the nose. The men put a revolver to his wife's head, threatened to blow her brains out if he didn't lead them to all their treasures. Mr. Cartridge told them, "Take everything you want, don't hurt us." But of course the men just laughed. Mr. Cartwright described them as being very cocky and arrogant, dressed in designer gear. One of them was wearing a very expensive watch, he noticed. The Cartridges emphatically believe that the men have done this before. They were experienced and exceedingly skilled criminals who thoroughly enjoyed the power they exerted towards the elderly couple. One of the thugs actually said to Mr. Cartridge, "I'd happily squash you under my boots until you turn to mush, so you better do everything I tell you, or you're a dead man." They were amazed they weren't killed. The aggression exerted towards them was quite frankly deadly. Mr. Cartridge believed if he had done one thing to upset the robbers, one thing out of line, he is certain they would have pulled the trigger on him. He was begging them not to kill his wife. He got the profound sense they would have happily just killed her, for the hell of it, just to upset him. It is hard to believe that there are godless people out there in our world who are willing to kill if it gives them deeper pockets. These men have no conscience, and I hope to God they get caught by the police, because believe me, they will target someone of great means again, and next time those people might not be so lucky to escape with their lives. But don't you worry, Montgomery. You have nothing to fear. The robbers will only target people of great means. I am most sure about that, said Violet, glancing around the interior of her home, raising her arms up in exasperation. I mean, what could they possibly want here? Nothing. We have got nothing for them. So there we are. That's the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and it gets very exciting, so I hope you're going to join me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.